Hello, Trevor.
Hey, Jeff.
It has been a while.
It has. I think it's been 2 months or so.
Yeah, it's you're definitely been on a list of the long list of people I like to if I can chat regularly with at least make it more often. So a couple of things we'll talk about, but one I think is you just mentioned was, of course, nobody else is here listening to that, but we're kind of discussing formatting of work. So I did a thing. Well, I did a thing. We did a thing. Not we, but a group of us did a thing called Journey to the Madlands, which I put out in an 8.5 by 11 format, and I think it came out roughly. I can't remember what I said. It was like 15.5. I can't remember what it was. The K words. So there's about 15,000 words, 15 to 16,000 words for a 60 in 60 pages. And you mentioned that you do Tales of the Smoking Wyrm, and your word count is about the same, but your format's still the standard zine size, the 5.5 by 8.5.
Oh, mine's actually smaller. Mine's 5 by 8. So
Oh my goodness,
it's a
you're
little
a
bit.
bad man.
I know it's a little bit smaller than that. As a matter of fact, so if you want to talk page count, I've been thinking about this because it was something that one of my editors, Brian Gilkison, asked me was how in the world are we going to budget things? You have to have a budget. He was very insistent that I had to have a budget at the very beginning. And I was like, screw a budget. I was like, we'll just build what we want to build and we'll figure out how much that's going to cost. And then I'll have a reference and we can go from there.
Yes.
That was issue one. Issue one had 19,500 words in it for 56 pages of content, 60 if you consider the covers, which also had material on them. Issues 2 and issues 3 had 14,500 words. Issue 4 has about 14,500 words, and they range at about 60 to 64 pages plus a cover. And so they're a little bit bigger with almost 5,000 less words, or with almost 1,000 less words. Yeah, 5,000 less words. And what's amazing about that is I go back and look at issue 1, and it still feels short to me when I look at it. But yeah, it has to do with me letting go and not cramming as much as I can into a page and forcing it, but letting my daughter, Caitlin, who's a professional book designer, she works for HarperCollins full time and then works for me as a side gig. So letting her do layout and not saying we have to fit this on a page, make it work and everything. So when we get a manuscript done, an issue's worth of manuscripts, I give her all the word files. They've all been edited. Everything's finalized. This is the text, right? And then she will sit down and lay that out the way she thinks it should be laid out. And what we've done is we've moved more towards bigger 2-page spreads for opening, with a little bit of text, and then more text, that it's a little more consistent. Anyway, so I let Caitlin think about space because I'm busy writing new material already at that point, and everything. So what I'm finding is, yeah, I mean, I think it works. Smoking Wyrm is it's really jam packed. I was actually looking at a couple of, I mean, like you, I have an entire bookshelf of zines, from the 70s all the way up to today now. And so over a 45-year period. And I was looking at some of the new zines that are selling for $20, which is our price point. I think actually issue 4 is going to come in at $22 because paper costs have gone up tremendously in the past 2 years. And so looking at that, I mean, some of these zines get out at 20 pages with maybe 1,000 words, and they have lots. They're more like art splash.
Right.
And those are beautiful. Don't get me wrong. And I pay for them, and other people do too. So clearly that is a winning model. And so, but Smoking Wyrm is consistently about 14 with that 1,000 words.
But why'd you choose 5 by 8? Why'd you cut off a ½ inch?
That is a good question. I don't have a good answer for you, except when we were initially considering size and shape and form, Caitlin and I had a long conversation about that, and I already had a bookshelf worth of material about that size. That's all gaming material, and so we stood there and looked at it, and that was the closest size to the old Arduin books and the old and the original TSR books.
So is this some sort of? Well, I wouldn't be, but why would theirs have been that size? They're not print. I mean, if it's Britain, I could say okay, there's some weird paper size. Well, I'd say weird, but yeah, I'll say it's weird. Their paper sizes are weird. Ours is the golden standard that everything should be measured. Uh, but I don't understand. I guess why are they either trimming paper, which I doubt.
No, I think they are.
So they're trimming. They're doing an 8.5 by 11. They're trimming a half an inch off.
Quarter inch off each side.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they're giving themselves a quarter inch extra gutter, and they're giving themselves a quarter inch extra outer edge bleeds, and then they're able to trim that to match. Because if you look at this, especially like I have all the Errol Otis books from the 70s, Booty and the Beast, Necromycan. I have a complete run of Arduin and a whole host of other people who produce stuff in the early 80s and late 70s. And because I've been collecting it now for about 10, 20 years. Actually, I've had Arduin since the beginning, so that'd be from the early 80s. And so if you look at it, their books are clearly trimmed in post-production. So they're not ragged at the edges. They're all lined up really nicely. They actually
that's a lot of paper to chopping off, though.
Well, and if you think about it, some of those Arduin books, the first 3 Arduin books, they clock in, and Booty and the Beast, Arduin books clock in at 64 to 96 pages saddle stitched, right? And Booty and the Beast is 128 saddle stitched.
Well, that makes sense there why you'd be trimming the daylights out of it, because you're going to have that much squirting out, squeeze out. I don't know what you call it.
Slug is the extra gutter
okay.
that you need, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I mean, but if you look at those books by today's standards, like Errol Otis's Necromycan, that's a little smaller than Booty and the Beast, which was at 126 or 128 pages, if I remember. I mean, he would have had that's 2 years worth of zines, right? That's a quarterly publication for a year and a half by most zine standards. And so yeah, so we've definitely gotten a lot smaller. I like that size. It's really I don't know what it is about it, but I like that it feels a little taller, and it feels a little narrower.
Yeah.
And that feels very proportionally nice. It has an aesthetic that is different. It looks weird when you line it up with a whole bunch of other books in terms of like, if you remember, I had a couple issues lined up there at the independent publishers booth at Gamehole Con. And so then it starts looking pretty small. But then I think if you look at the thickness, you realize that thing is 60 pages. There's a lot on there.
I think the Planner Compass, is a little different size, and I can't remember what theirs is.
If I remember correctly, their was A5 folded in half or something.
So what does that come to be?
So A5 is like 6 and a widgy something, 6.23 inches by 9.17 or something like that for European A5.
Yeah, I thought theirs was US smaller. A5. Theirs was fairly square. It felt more square. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just losing it.
Anyway, so I mean, all of these, what I find is amazing is that everybody has a different, size, and so 6 by 9 is pretty standard. 8.5, 5.5 by 8.5 is really standard.
I think I'm going to go to 6. I think 6 by 9 is where I'm going.
When I look at 6 by 9, you look at Old School Essentials, which are not really zines anymore; they're books.
Right.
They have a nice feel at 6 by 9. There's also there's a couple of publishers that'll print those saddle stitched or Smith bound, and they come out looking really good. Yeah, and so I think I'm going to do a couple of books at 6 by 9. But we will not be changing the size of Smoking Wyrm.
No, people hate you for that. I never thought about it, because Journey to the Madlands, I was going to be like, yeah, I'll just do this one big, and the rest will just be normal.
Oh my God,
that's
heresy.
Yeah, people are like, no, I like the size. Like, okay, I guess so.
I mean, I can't tell you how many problems I have with like my old white dwarfs, which are true. They're a European size, and then they moved to an American size about issue 20, or something like that. So the first 15 or 20 white dwarfs are really tall and thin, and then they squatted down, and they're a nightmare to try and keep organized in any format. Like, I mean, I can't put them in binders together, or, on the shelf I have to have wasted space because these like, a couple
Right.
at the end need an extra inch
Well,
or
and it's
two.
also people I think are, people that kind of quote unquote collect, they want it to be consistent. They don't want this, unless everyone is a weird size for its own cuteness. I mean, there's nobody really wants a set of things. I didn't think about that. They
Yeah,
want to be consistent.
absolutely. So yeah, and I wonder what it's like to work at the bigger scale sometimes. So I've been toying. I got a couple upcoming projects, and I'm toying with size. And so, I mean, I'm going to keep the Smoking Wyrm consistent, and my new zine, which is Smoking Wyrm monograph, it will remain consistent, although the format style will change depending on how many words are, word count. And so the first two are actually fairly small, but they have extra cards. So that makes them a little more expensive, equivalent to what I do for Smoking Wyrm in terms of cost. And then, if not more, a little more expensive. And then the later ones will be thicker without cards and stuff. And so they're designed to be a monograph, something where I intensely explore one topic. So,
My intent, I think my reason for going to 6 by 9, I think has more to do with I started with 8.5 by 11, and
mhm.
I crammed everything in, and it's like, you know what, I'd like a little bit more margin. So really, what I'm doing is just saying I kind of want to keep similar to the format of the 8.5 or the 5.5 by 8.5, but I want to actually have a little more room for text or for the margin, and also maybe between columns I may add a little bit of space.
So one of the things I've been working on is a couple of modules. I don't do modules by and large. I do location settings, and I want to be able to. I've been thinking about what is the ideal module. I call mine set pieces, right? So a location description piece. What does that look like? And what's the functionality difference between the judge, the person who's running it, and the player, the person who's receiving it or experiencing it? And how do you optimize that? One of the things I've never been truly happy with is, while modules can be wildly, fantastically wonderful, I don't think the layout on modules is very good. And so, I've always wanted little notes on the side that remind me to link things on different pages together and stuff like this. Little eye catches, right, for the judge. And so I've always wondered if a module shouldn't be built with more with layout and design that is attuned to the person running it, to catch
Right.
their eye and say, hey, don't forget that this thing relates to the other thing on page 32 or whatever, right? Because one of the things that I have a problem when I run through a module is I often forget those things, or I can't find them. I think I know, hey, there's a link, but then I have to like hunt for it, right? And so one of the things that we've been playing with, Caitlin and I, is better design in locations and everything.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and it does not. I don't consume a lot of modules, but I know the ones adventures and such that I've actually have read and maybe tried to run. I usually find very poorly designed for the GM to. It may be okay to read, but when you go to actually run it, it makes no sense, or it's very difficult. Or you're paging through stuff, and it's not clear what's important and what's not. What links to what and how it's just like I don't really understand why major publishers cannot spend a little bit more time and just get an editor to properly make sure an adventure is easy to run at the table.
Right. And okay, so I think that comes in two flavors, the problem that we're discussing. I think that one of them is editorial control and bloat, and a desire by several companies to work on hardback format for modules.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Which means that having anything below 64 pages is just about not worth your time. And so
Well, I
128
think it's,
pages.
yeah, not only is it just it's not the page count that matters, but they want to take you to 15th level in those pages too.
Yeah. And so that's really hard to do. And so they end up reading like books. I haven't bought any of the fifth edition modules because of that.
Oh,
Um,
good night.
and
You
I
need to
did a
do this to yourself once. You
yeah.
need to suffer once for us, Trevor.
Well, I did suffer. I suffered through Fantasy Flight's Warhammer series. As a matter of fact, I was a primary playtester for them at that time. So I've got my name through tons of credits of the Warhammer stuff that they did. And consistently I kept writing them notes saying, I love the concept behind, this product, say Chaos Commandment, which was one that we play tested. I said, however, you cannot functionally run this, right? This is essentially a novel, and it's written in paragraph format with the motivations of NPCs laid out across 20 or 30 pages for one NPC. I'm like, this is insane. So, as a judge, I have a hard time wrapping my head around a non-player character or whatever the thing is that I'm looking at. I mean, when a room description goes to 4 pages, 8.5 by 11, right? Block text. You know that you're really writing a novel and you're not writing a module. And so the question is does bulleting help? Does numbering help? Does creating smaller chunks,
Right.
creating flavor text for those who want it, creating highlight callouts in the flavor text for those who want to paraphrase. One of the things that I've been playing with, and I have a set piece. My first set piece location is done. A manuscript is completely finished. I've play tested it about half a dozen times, and everything. One of the things we're adding are situational tables, so that everybody who is in a room or in a space perceives things a little differently. Some people pick up on different cues, and we randomize those so that players have a different experience, and then have a reason to communicate. Right? Hey, did anybody hear that thing? That sounded like an alligator, you know.
Right.
And everyone's like, no, I didn't hear that. Where was that from? And you're like, oh, it's coming down here, so it gives the players a reason to interact instead of, okay, room 3, it has a dusty skeleton and some treasure in the corner. We'll roll for initiative, which is kind of boring. And it's that question between role playing and role playing, right? That has been going on in role playing games since the 70s, since the beginning.
Well, I think the thing too is, I think I don't want to say it's two different brains, but there's the creative part where a person says, you know what, I have a direction for this adventure. I got these ideas, and they put it on paper, and that takes one type of thinking.
Yeah.
And there's another type of thinking that's saying, okay, how do we convey this information to the audience that we want to convey it to in the most efficient manner?
And that's right. So that, to me, we talked about I said it came in 2 flavors. The first flavor is editing, right? Making sure that you're not writing a novel. The
Right.
second flavor is design, making sure that your things are laid out in a way that are functionally useful versus, just making the most use of space. So the most use of space and the best use of space are not the same thing.
Right.
And so if you're trying to jam in something into 16 or 32 or 8 pages or 64 pages, which are kind of the general module ranges that I've seen, and you've gotten a little bit wordy, you're going to sacrifice illustrations, you're going to sacrifice space and everything. And so there's been a trend, the reverse of that is are the games like, my understanding is Troika, Morkborg, and things like this, where everything is on a page, right? Mothership does this too, if I remember correctly. And they're trying to give you everything you can on a single page. Well, that's not always possible. I'm looking for some fine balance between that, but I'd like to have 90% of what I need for any given encounter on a page. And then I'd like to have call outs when I need to go to another page, so that I'm like, oh, this is here, or I need to make a note that this monster died. It's not going to be here, and I can go to that page and make that note. And it would be great if something is super important. If you have a creature that's important in 2 locations, but if it dies in location A, something different happens in location B. For me to make a note of that and just like have a checkbox. This monster died. Oh, now I know I
I think
remember.
they could be true for like wandering monsters, or you may have a set group that's a set size, but you may meet a portion of them
Yeah.
randomly, and then they need to be removed from that tally, both as in the overall dungeon as well as the random encounter outside.
And it may be heresy, but I think modules are meant to be written in, right? I think judges are meant to take notes in them
Yeah,
for the.
Mortimer Adler said, I think this is How to Read a Book. I believe he said that you don't own a book until you write in
Yeah. And so
it.
for instance, one of the rooms that I'm working in, and one of the things that I created has a whole bunch of traps, and they have reset times, and they have number of, the trap can go off 3 times before it needs to be reset and stuff. And so giving those little trackers on the margins, really, really helpful, right? Because I'm not going to remember if players have been dumb and they've set off a trap 4 times versus 3 times, how that, because I don't know about you, but although I play weekly, sometimes we don't always play the same thing, and so I may be returning to something a year later. And
Yeah, that's where I think in some ways I'm against. Even I don't normally play games that have like a counter, like resets or whatever. But I think I'm kind of more into a random generator, like, or random if it does or doesn't go off or whatever it may be. I think we need, for me at the table, I much prefer something that I don't have to keep track of, that I can determine the die roll or
and
something.
you can certainly set that up that way, but it doesn't take much effort to put those little trackers in the margin if you have
Yeah,
enough margin.
yeah, and I
So
think the other thing too is right. Exactly what you're saying. You're what you're doing is you're making. I'm sorry. So you're kind of you're making both a adventure, but also kind of a worksheet for the GM at the same time.
yeah,
Yep.
and I'm leaving it on the page that you need it,
Yeah,
right?
but nobody's gonna write in that zine if you're gonna put
I'm
it in
going to
the
write
zine.
in my zines.
What you need to do, maybe we could do. I guess people, if I guess it goes to another thing. I wonder how many people. The other thing is you could just make a version that's printable, so people can use. That might be an idea too.
You could, and you know what? I mean, certainly, I have printed zines that were PDF only, but laid out to be printed, and saddle stitch stapled them myself and folded them and everything. That's a thing. But I mean, I believe that a written thing, a module, is a utilitarian device as well as being a thing of art.
Yeah, but once people start putting them in plastic sleeves, it's just not going to happen.
Right, but I mean, so collectors do that,
Yeah,
right? I mean, there is a collector's market,
yeah,
but for every comic book that went into a sleeve, 100 got destroyed, and they were loved and they were looked at many times. And I think the same thing is true with modules. For as quote unquote rare as some of the first edition D&D modules seem to be now, you have to remember that at certain time they had print runs of 100,000 a year, right?
it's insane.
That is insane. 100. If you know what, if you and I could sell 100,000 of something, we would certainly be happy people, and it would be a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
but I mean, if you think about it, so that means that things like Tomb of Horrors, the G series, have at least. I mean, nobody knows what the true print run on those are, but it has to be several 100,000 were originally printed. And the same thing is true with comic books. In the 80s got up to 100,000 print runs finally. So wow. I mean, you would think that they would be falling off trees,
Right, exactly.
metaphorically, as a gamer, that they would always be in those locations where you were at. But clearly, people tore them apart and abused them, and spilled Dr. Pepper on them or whatever it was that they were drinking at the time, and and everything. So yeah, they didn't survive. Certainly not in great condition, which is why they're valuable now.
Yeah, and I think and I think what you bring up is a great point. It's just, I just, I don't know. The other thing too, I guess, the thing is you want it in the book as you're doing it, so you don't really want a separate booklet for your zine,
Right.
because now you got to keep track of two documents. And that's not fun at the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think with the uh, playing around with Forge and with their journal system,
Uh-huh.
I think that there's a lot of opportunity. It makes things like referencing other areas easy and referencing monsters easy and taking notes easy. But of course, the cost is there's an upfront cost of setting all that stuff up and having to have internet and all that kind of stuff. So it is kind of a dilemma, you know, as a GM keeping track of information. That is always that is the hard thing, especially since usually we're on the spot. So there's a little bit of adrenaline going or
Yep.
tension of trying to not keep the game going, but yet you also need to find information. And I think there's still, I think like you, because when I put stuff together, I try to think a lot about, you know, that kind of, you know, the information flow. And I think we still are nowhere near where we need to be. I think people start doing different things. I don't think, kind of like you, I think individually they're great ideas. They may not be the right idea, but I think eventually we will come to better practices.
Yeah.
I think we
And
know what's
and
bad
so that's
practices, but we don't know what the
right.
best practices are.
So that's why I've been exploring that. You know, so it's been something of, you know, how can I find the layout and organization that I need to be a functional piece of utilitarian writing, and still not sacrifice the cool factor that makes these situations really fun for players. And another thing, think of it, it's not just writing, it's also art. I think we've talked about this before. The great art in modules is wasted on the person who doesn't need it the most, right? Because you either have to hold your module up and say, look, don't look at the text, look at
Right.
this picture, or you have to photocopy it and copy it, or you have to get a digital version and print out just the art, take a screenshot or something. And so that's why when we produced this first issue of Smoking Wyrm monograph, we put I commissioned art from an artist, and I commissioned him to do just the art that the players needed to see. Now I reproduced parts of that is as filler and stuff for the judge where I had room. Um, but we put those on tarot card is what we're putting them on tarot cards so that you can just hold a card up and say, this is who you see. And the player, and you know that there's no information that's important on that side of the card. And then on the back of the cards, we'll put the stat blocks and everything too, in case you just want to run off those. Um, or
And I think that was the genius of the older modules, some of them, but it seemed to get lost, you know, like the uh, Barrier Peaks, for instance.
yeah, that had the inserts that pulled out.
But the failure was they'd have like sometimes multiple images on one page.
Yep. So that's the problem. So then you have this problem of, okay, now I've got a set of art cards, like the first issue of Smoking Wyrm has, I think it's 18 or 17 cards. And I got a book, right, that has the module in it. What do I do in terms of how do I haul these both around, in a good fashion without losing one or the other? And so what we decided to do was take the inside back cover and put a sleeve in it, like you would have for a library card, and then put so that it could fit the art cards in the back, and that you could carry the whole thing together. Um, and so I'm exploring what that means, and everything. And so that's been an interesting design dilemma, to have to play with these
I
things.
think I think the idea of tarot cards is as far as aesthetically superior, but what got me thinking was you could just also and on a cheaper, not for you, but I mean for myself thinking about this is that one could also do at the back of the book one image per page,
You could.
but it could potentially, you know, significantly eat up your page. I mean, if you have a set page count, it's going to eat up a lot of pages, potentially,
That's
or a
right.
number of pages.
And so the art cards are kind of cool because they can be used for multiple things. Um, Sometimes, I don't know if you've ever encountered this, but sometimes an NPC becomes a player character. or gets adopted and becomes like a retainer or something.
Yeah.
So it's really nice to be able to just hand the player, here's the creature, and here is its stats on the back. So that's a useful utilitarian thing as well. And then and everything. So there's some advantages and disadvantages, and you have to weigh the pros and cons of those things. The other thing that allows us to do is for those who want to work in a digital space, because the art is designed for player consumption, I don't have to do much digital editing to make virtual tokens and stuff like this, right? That's just a matter of kind of stamping out a circle or whatever and keeping the monster there, making digital pogs or whatnot. And so that's kind of cool because it allows me to use that art in different ways. It has been a really interesting design process. And so, and my daughter, who is that primary designer, Caitlin and I go back and forth. I have certain sensibilities. She has certain sensibilities. I have certain design requirements.
Well, does she play RPGs?
She did once or twice. I traumatized her too much as a kid, and so she won't play with us anymore. But yeah, she has in the past. So she has some she has some understanding of how that works.
Right.
What she doesn't have is 35 years of running experience.
And I think the thing is she's got I won't say real world experience, but outside experience. So she has her chops as far as layout, but she just doesn't have the intimate knowledge of the subject matter.
Yeah, and so that's a nice marriage, right?
Yeah.
Although sometimes we butt heads on things. I'm like, no, I need this here and this here. One of the things that we've been experimenting with is increasing the outside page margin, not the inside page margin, but the outside page margin, to put little call outs and stuff in,
yeah,
those trackers in. And so there's a functional space that the game master can rely on that says when something is here, it means you need to pay attention.
And that's where I think if you go up on, if you're not doing it for a Smoking Wyrm, you can go up on your size of your zine and it would accommodate it.
Right. And so for monograph, it's still at the same size. It makes it kind of hard, but it is possible for shorter things to do it that way. When I have moved on to I've got a new product line that's going to come out. Oh, I think I'm going to do a Kickstarter in June or July for the first one. It's called Sandbox Set Pieces, and that'll come out, and it'll have it will be in a 6x9 format. That's the format we're playing with, and it has a little discussion in the front as to how these things work. I resurrected a grammar tool from the 13th century in order to work with it, and which was kind of fun. And so so it's been interesting to play with. To me, trying to crack that nut of making something utilitarian and still cool and useful is from a designer point of view is the kind of the thrill, right? That's the, can I get this to really work the way I want it to work, the way I think it should be able to work? That has a huge amount of appeal. And everything. It requires creating a set of tools.
It does, and it's hard. I think you got the fortune of having a group of people. I've been so I've just hired my first developmental editor. So I think I just needed for some things to get another set of eyes on it to think through. Because it's easy for me to think it's very easy for me to think a certain way, and it's not very clear or whatever it may be. I don't know. But it's kind of good to have another set of eyes to say, critically, this is not, or this is good, or you need to adjust here and adjust there, beyond just a copy editor, just correcting grammar.
Yeah.
Or, exactly. Or making word flow. Not correcting grammar, but, correcting, the clarity.
And so I have, you're right. I do have both of those. And I have a copy editor, I have a content editor, and I have a developmental editor team. Although I usually rely on just one or two people for that. And so those are people you need to be able to trust. You need to be able to, especially developmental editors, I find that you need to have a good rapport with them and everything. So, hiring one out of the blue that's kind of, that's really commendable.
That's right,
Because
dude.
you need to build that relationship and understand that you're both working on the same page,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And so I've discovered that just talking to other zine producers, the reason we make these things is because at some level we're dissatisfied with the product we were getting, right? At some level, it's maybe not the only reason, but it is some of the reason. Every single person I've ever met who produces their own zine looked at another person's product and said, I can do that the way I think it should be done. And so that, yeah, there's a lot of different opinions there.
There is, and I'm right. I think, yeah, if not even better, it's just like I just have an idea too that I don't see is out there.
Yeah. Or
It's
if you
just,
do see it out there, I could execute it in a different manner or a better manner. Yeah. Yeah. And but that's why we do what we do. That's the cool thing.
oh yeah, exactly. And I think for us too, it's like, for me, it's like I also know that what I'm wanting to put out. I mean, we can all just on our own crank out a Word file, print it out, and send it out into the wild. But we really want it to just be the best thing that maybe that it can be, but something the best that we can make it within a reasonable scope.
Exactly. I mean, for 25 years, I produced Word files for my friends that we use at the gaming table. Right?
Yeah.
Whether we were playing Vampire and we were creating Ghoul rules because they hadn't come out yet, or whatever the game was, we created a custom player character class, and here it is. I have this really cool artifact that I recovered, or that I discovered years ago. I would have been the early 90s, very early 90s. I came across a group. I was a military brat, and so my dad was stationed in Alamogordo, New Mexico, at White Sands Air Force Base. And so I came across a group of gamers. They were all GIs, and they had been gaming, but two or three of them had come from Wisconsin and Michigan, and they had been gaming in some of the kind of ancestral gaming groups that had spawned out of the original TSR kind of people that had formed TSR and stuff. And they had a loose accumulation of literally dot matrix printed handouts that were like the running notes for somebody, for what they actually mentioned. They were like, look, these were games that came out of some of Gary Gygax's early work on Greyhawk. And so they had all these notes on Greyhawk that were never published. And and so I got a copy of those, and those are great. I mean, so yeah, I mean, we worked with Word files for years, even before there was Word. And so, but it's the cool thing is working with artists and getting it laid out and making it look professional.
Right. And that's what you need to do. I mean, you need to up the game in order to get the funds to be able to make the product what you really want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some people are lucky. I mean, some people are, they're great artists and they can do the layout and they can write and they don't have to go anywhere. And so, I mean, that's a route I kind of tried to take. It was going to take me 37 years to get to that point.
Yeah. And I work on a little bit of the other things. I mean, I've been working on PageMaker or InDesign now since it was PageMaker 2.0. And so I have some design things, and that was actually a route that I considered doing as professionally for a long time because I loved it. So I've done it for years just on the sly, but Caitlin's faster.
Oh yeah. In fact, I got my daughter, she's doing the layout for Fane of the Fly God.
Yeah.
And so anyway, she's also like you. I mean, I've been improving my skills, I'm getting better and better and better. But she's still way better than I am. And she can bring also, I can find myself, I'm just making changes in my abilities as I go. But I'm not able to make as far as styles go, I'm not able to make radical changes, in ways of thinking. So it's like I get them better. I can see different ways of doing things, but I can't see things in radically different ways where she can do that.
Yes, I would agree. So there's a generational difference there, but I like having that skill, even though I'm slow, because I can kind of work on things before we have a conversation, right? I can do a layout and say, this is where I'm headed. thinking wise. This is my
Right.
brain is trying to put these things on the page and explain to you how I want it laid out. And it's good to have a mock-up of that. Um, so I can say, this is how we should execute this. This to me makes sense in a utilitarian fashion. Um, and then she'll come in and say, well, this is crap, Dad. And she'll change it and everything and stuff and say, well, we should tweak this here and put this here.
Yeah, and I think that's just it. I mean, the use of space, the use of, letting all these, there's a lot of other factors that sometimes you can vastly improve something without necessarily making huge changes, but
Yeah.
it's just that, it's just like I say, I everything I've been doing so far from the beginning when my first personal zine, which is really taking reformatting Caves of Chaos and redrawing the caves. It was my very first thing, all the way to where I'm at now. It's just been one step at a time, where
Right.
where it's like that's the only thing I can do is one step beyond what I'm doing now, not 5 steps or 3 steps sideways or 7 steps the other direction. It's just that's where it comes in. If somebody's got who's done many different things than I've done, many different things.
Yeah.
So, and I think, it's still going back to design, usability, design space. And I think, there's so much room. I think even though I don't own Morkborg, um, and even though there's some zines I picked up, I really hate for the readability. It does go to show that the design space within RPGs, I'm glad that they're pushing boundaries. Even though there are areas that I think have gone too far, but I still think it's a great thing that it's such a vital medium. It's not just a set. This is what it must be.
Right. Yeah. And you know what? You need people to push those boundaries to understand where that boundary exists.
There's a saying, and I think it's true, maybe not universally true, but the question is, how do you know if you've gone far enough? Is you go too far and pull back.
Yeah.
So sometimes, yeah, so these people sometimes may be going too far, but still it's like, that's good. Just out back a little bit and we should, it'll be even better. But it just takes those people going too far and even ourselves going too far.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, so that was, that kind of ties in with your conversation you had with Phil Reed the other day, right? And Phil was saying, I love this Morkborg concept,
Yeah.
but I need mine to be Phil Reed's version of Morkborg, because it needs to be readable. And I agree with him. I have glasses and slowly but surely it's my vision is changing and my eyes need to be able to appreciate something on the page to run it. And if they can't understand what they're looking at, that's a problem. That doesn't mean I don't think it's aesthetically not nice and pleasing. It means that, I think that for me, that doesn't work.
Well, it's like, for me, it's like Coriolis, beautiful book. And I mentioned on one of the podcasts, but if they offered another version that was like the old Traveler, where it's just mostly text, with just a little bit of pictures and just formatted in 2 columns, I'd buy that just to be able to run it. And they just reformatted it and made it clear. I'd have one copy. Okay, this is a beautiful one to look at. This is one to skim through. But this is the copy I really use. This is the copy I write in. This is the copy. But I don't think there's any sales model that really, or it's probably marketing wise doesn't make any sense. But it's like there's a number of books. It's like they're beautiful books, but my goodness, I really wouldn't mind just a stripped down, no nonsense, type of book to go with the beautiful book.
I agree. And I'll give you a good classic example of that. I have I forget if it was 20 or 25th, probably 25th anniversary version of Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu. That was the first premier Smith's Own leather bound. It's a green version. It has the star on it, the star symbol, and either in red or gold. And so I bought those when they came out. They made like, I don't know, 250 or 125 of them. And so it's a beautiful version of the book. They totally reformatted it and relayed it out. This was back in 5th edition, and I got it and I was super excited. And I opened the book and I discovered that it was near illegible. that I could not actually, I mean, I could appreciate it for a beautiful piece of work, but I couldn't appreciate it as this was not a book I was going to be able to game with at the table. And so, so I have 5 copies of Call of Cthulhu 5th edition, because that's the edition that I can read the best. You know, and so as the editions have gone on over the years, I have just accumulated that 5th edition printing in the softback. Sorry, I've got a cat playing in my window.
That's okay.
In the softback version, and I just bought them for $4 and $5 a piece whenever I found them, so that I could hand them out to players, so that we could just say, look, I'm going to play 5th edition. You don't have to worry about it. I know that, you know, 6th and 7th edition exist, but we're going to go with this one. And here's a copy. So,
well, it probably wouldn't be hard. I don't know. You know, I'm not I don't run, and we don't really. They call Cthulhu actually Cthulhu games have actually been other systems, but it probably wouldn't be that difficult to just make some, as a GM, some changes using the 7th edition without having to use new books for the players, I would imagine.
you know, my understanding is they're very similar. I've just never bothered to buy them because I have 5 copies of 5th, and that game works great. So.
Yeah, I think there's some things that's really well liked, but I don't know them enough to be able to espouse them. But it does seem like the changes between editions of Cthulhu are much less than they are, say, between versions of D&D.
Oh, absolutely, right? I mean, it's not like they're going to throw out the basic role-playing game with Call of Cthulhu. It is the basic role-playing game, and so system that Chaosium put together. They're going to tweak things like how occupation packages work and stuff like this. It's going to be really minor stuff, right?
Yeah,
the system has not changed.
I thought the Delta Green, I was really impressed when I played we played a kind of I'll call it a campaign. I was really impressed with, it's a more stripped down version of basic role playing, but I thought it was actually perfect.
Yeah, you know, that basic role playing system, Chaosium has a great, I mean, it's been through multiple iterations, through superheroes, through high fantasy, through low fantasy, through horror, and it is a good workable system. And so I certainly have a, you know, it has a spot in my life, and I enjoy playing those games. I don't play Call of Cthulhu as much as I could, but you know, when we do, we kind of go all in for 6 months to a year, and then
to me, what I don't like is less about the mechanics, and it's just the enormous number of skills. To me, it makes more sense to consolidate them down. You know,
sure. So in that instance, Rolemaster is going to be a nightmare for you.
Yes,
but I have to tell you, in terms of skills, I have long appreciated the Rolemaster system. I think that it has a beautiful way of reducing everything to a skill check. You know, I mean, whether it's hit point creation, that's a skill. Whether it's casting magic, that's a skill. And so they did away with the different subsystems, and they just said, we have one subsystem to rule them all, and it works like this. And they've been very consistent throughout.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like the difference between, let's say, I'm not sure if, I'm not going to say Call of Cthulhu has this, or basic role playing, but like, yeah, swim skill, you got to run skill, you got to climb, like, just make athletics.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, is if your game focuses on a certain style of play, then those skills should be more broken down, and then, but the stuff that doesn't necessarily apply, like if your game is about fighting, and your game is about being, you know, we'll say gladiators, then, and having different skills and having maybe weapons broken down makes more sense. But maybe some of your knowledge skills, you just want one knowledge roll. But then if you're playing Call of Cthulhu, you may just say, you know what, we need to consolidate a bunch of these weapon skills. I don't need to know whether it's a short sword, long sword, trident, who cares? You know, this doesn't come up that often. But what's important is, you know, do you have, you know, like say library use, that becomes important.
Yeah. And so that, you know, interesting that you mentioned Delta Green, because, you know, early in the days prior to Delta Green, They were doing Unspeakable Oath. The very early Unspeakable Oaths had like a 2 or 3 part series on firearms of World War One, or firearms between 1890 and 1910, and literally had like 500 firearms, right? And those each had a different skill, and you were like,
Yeah.
geez, that's insane. However, what you had was, you had somebody who was clearly a gun enthusiast,
Yeah, right.
who clearly a World War One enthusiast, and is like, well, there's a difference between the way this one fires and the way that one fires, and they're fundamentally different things.
It does. It's true in the physical world, but in the narrative world, it doesn't really matter.
Right. Yeah. So what's the outcome? So then you get to an extreme like Dungeon Crawl Classics, which literally has an equipment page that fits on a quarter of a page, right, for weapons, and that's it. You have like, I know there can't be more than 25 weapons in that game, standard.
Right.
Uh, and so or you have Palladium's Compendium of Weapons. I don't know if you've ever seen that. That's a beautiful book, and it just
Yeah.
has thousands of different weapons in it, and a very quick conversion system for different game systems in the back.
Yeah, and I think, and if your game is about nuances of fighting, it makes sense.
Yeah, yeah,
But and it's kind of like going back to the hero system, where it was kind of made where you could make it more crunchy, or you could make it more less crunchy. But the idea one guy was saying is like, damage is pretty arbitrary. Like if you get stabbed with a knife, you're going to die just as quickly as you get stabbed with a sword or get shot with a gun. One stab and you're dead. I mean, you can look at it that way too. It's like, it's a blade of steel going into your, or lead going into your body. It's like
yeah,
you can get all nuancy, but still, you get stabbed, you die. I mean, there's people that get stabbed with a small dagger, and they're dead.
yeah. It just depends on where you hit. So you're right. That's an interesting question. White Wolf, during the vampire time, second edition vampire, I think it was, first and second, in the player's handbook, I guess that'd be the first edition player's handbook, had primary skills, right, which was the ones that came on your character sheet, and then had secondary and tertiary skills, which added to that. So if I was an occultist, I could have, intelligence was occult, and so could the fighter guy standing next to me. But then I could lay in additional skills below that all stacked or gave me different benefits.
And that makes
And,
sense.
and that was interesting because not everybody had to use them. But for people who really wanted to be, I want to know exactly what Archimedes blah 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 does, right? You
But
could you could
but
really
but
do
you
that.
could like have like melee skill.
Yeah,
It's that, but then your sub skills could be knife, sword, trident, whatever.
and then you could get into even further third tertiary skills too.
Yeah, that's a little crazy there.
I am just a master of the Kopesh, right? I mean, if it's not a Kopesh, I'm not rolling with things. And so yeah. But what it did was it allowed for that scope, right? And so the benefits got less and less, if I remember correctly, as you drilled down into something.
And I mean, there's probably a certain amount of elegance to that, and I shouldn't do that. I think just for me, I tend to want something more simple. But you're right. It doesn't require that level of complexity. It's just that the player wanted, if they got enjoyment out of that, they could go to that detail without breaking the game.
Yeah, yeah. And then the player who didn't care about that didn't even have to think about it,
Yeah.
and they still had skills, right? And that was the primary thing, was that it's a pool system, so it's skill plus attribute. And so they were like, yeah, I'm just pulling these things together, and okay, that guy gets 10 extra dice, but he spent a whole bunch of extra XPs on these sub skills that I just don't care about. And I now can, I bought a discipline. I can levitate to the sky. So, and so it all evens out in the end. And so yeah. So those are the things that I think about when I think of design. And I think, yeah.
Well, since we were not getting the topic I really intended to, that's okay. Let's go
We can
further.
talk flies if you want to talk flies.
No, we need
No
to warm
problem.
up and do a whole session on flies. So no, we're going to keep going because the flow is here, and because I think this is also a tie-in to a question that you posted on the RPG Zine group
Yeah.
about like why don't you go ahead and kind of restate what that question is before I restate it wrong?
Which one? Which question? I've
It was
asked.
about the process for getting I was like getting work done for a project. Like, what's your
Oh
method?
yeah, I think I asked the question, and this actually ties into. So I have started co-hosting a podcast, a little Twitch channel thing called the Scrivenery, with Ed Stanek, who is a fellow Cincinnatian, but also a DCC RPG.
Are you putting this on Anchor too?
I don't know.
Why don't
You
you
know what
record
happens
the
is
just
I
record the
record it,
audio?
and then Goodman deals with all that. It's part of we. I'm just co-hosting it. I'm not the primary
They need to be
motivator.
putting that on Anchor. I'll listen to it. I won't watch it on Twitch, not because I
Yeah.
hate Twitch, but I listen to consume audio.
Well, I'll pass that on because I know it eventually goes to YouTube, but I don't think it ends up as podcast. But you know what? I mean, it really could. Although we do often reference visual things. We
I don't
haven't.
care.
Yeah.
I, you'll get at least one person on listening to your podcast if it goes audio.
Yeah. All right. I'll let them know. So Ed and I we were talking about, we kind of went through, this was a general tutorial on how to create third-party games and everything, and just like some of the general thoughts, right? And then I was like, well, I'd love to do an episode on um, muse, right? And so I think I asked the question on the Facebook group, on the RPG zines group, what is the muse that drives you, the motivation thing that helps you get to the end of the day, and finish the project. I think that was kind of the verbiage. And that was tying in. I was actually looking for feedback that I was going to pull into that.
Okay, I thought you were more from methodology. You're saying, what is the muse?
Yeah, it is. What is the muse, right? So a muse is a motivator. It could be a person, or it could be a thing, or a concept. It doesn't even have to be a person. And so it is, how do you get things done? What is it that drives you, or what is it that you can use to inspire you to finish a project? And I got a whole bunch of cool, interesting feedback on that. You participated in it. A lot of people talked about music that drives them, and certainly that's true. I am a big believer in wordless music while I'm writing. If I'm doing art or an illustration, like I do technical drawings sometimes I'm working on right now one for the aerial book that I was working on that we chatted about prior to you starting recording. That documents the boundary layers and talks about wind movement and doldrums in the
Yeah.
sky and stuff. So I've been working on this technical document. So I will listen to worded music when I do that, some like artist, whether it's Dire Straits or whatever. But I'm a huge believer in sound scores and soundtracks to drive me while I'm writing.
Let me rephrase, because I think I stated, but I think my it's different. It's way different for me.
Oh yeah.
So what you're saying is you have a project in mind and you're trying to find a muse to inspire you to the directions you need to go.
That's one way to look at it. Or the other way to look at it is, I want to build something, but I don't quite know what I want to build. Right. Most of the time, I find that the thing that strikes me to motivate me to build something comes out of a random location. I'll be walking down the grocery aisle. I'll see a cover to some Metamucil box or something, and I'll go, "Oh my God, I need to create, grains for my fantasy game," or whatever it happens to be. Right? I mean, things will just pop into my head. It's a horrible, horrible thing to have happen to you in an inconvenient spot most of the time. And so I keep a notebook that I jot things down.
So it doesn't go like that for me. What happens to me is it's I do see something, but it's not a like, oh, I need to do something. It all of a sudden becomes a compulsion. It
Yeah,
becomes an irrational driving compulsion that will not leave me alone until I do it.
yeah. And so I find that I can get like thought earworms where they just won't go away, and I will continue to write on things. That's why I carry a notebook. So I actually have by the way, a 6x9 notepad, a little folded journal that I take with me, and I have it in a leather case, so I can. It's just in a leather binder, so I carry it everywhere I go. If I leave the house, right now it's actually sitting in my car because I haven't brought it in, but that's where I can write notes no matter where I'm at, whether I'm traveling, It's small enough to carry with me, whether I'm just going on errands, you know, and I'm sitting outside the grocery store and an idea hits me. I try and jot those things down and then expand on them later.
So it never works for me that way.
So, or sometimes I'll go and sit while my daughter is gaming, my youngest daughter. She'll go to games and I'll sit there because it's only going to be a 3-hour thing. And while I'm listening to them, I'll be thinking of ideas and stuff. So that's one. That's
so
one
I can't really think of ideas. I really just, yeah, it's. I shouldn't say I never think of ideas. I might kind of have an idea, but generally I just have to write it out.
So you'll have a thought and you're like, I need to develop this. Is that how that
Yeah,
works?
it's like a direction. It's like, you know what? I have to walk to Chicago.
Got
I
it.
have to walk to Chicago. But maybe I don't really have a compass initially. And I just start walking. And then somebody starts pointing. I'm like, okay. And I will get to Chicago, but there's never like, it feels like what you do in some ways is you get bits and pieces and you start putting together, like I think you mentioned a structure where I will just start walking.
Yeah. And so sometimes that happens that way. I have a structure, I have an idea. This is something that I want to produce. Other times, this happens a lot with my game world. My game world eventually got enough detail that I started creating an encyclopedia entry system. So I have an encyclopedia for my game world that I've written, and it's just a Word file. As a matter of fact, it's not laid out or anything. And if I am finding myself, I want to create, but I don't know what I want to create, I will sit there and I will add entries to my encyclopedia. And so what I'll do is I'll go through the encyclopedia and find something and say, I mentioned this here under this entry. Do I have an entry for it? No. Well, then I'll go add it and I'll make a note on the back of the page and I'll expand on it. And then that'll lead to more entries and that'll lead to more entries. And so what I found is I can get myself very inspired to write something and get really enthusiastic about something just by editing the encyclopedia, right? It takes no forethought. I simply open it to a random page and begin scanning for a reference that I have not included in the encyclopedia yet. That's in an entry, but doesn't have its own entry. And so I will then start adding entries. And
So you really, and I think what you're doing is you're creating a different mental space than what you're currently in. You have to get into a mental space.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I want to do that, but I mean, because sometimes I have an intellectual drive to work on it, but I find that my brain is burdened by worldly cares, right? Whether it's I've got to do the bills or the dishes or I need to vacuum, but I really don't want to. I'd rather be writing. And these things don't leave my mind. I can get myself in that space very quickly by doing that.
Yeah, normally I'd save it for those times. There's plenty of other things that I can do that don't require that brain being in that space.
Right.
So
And I think you wrote that, right? You said there's the make stuff up MS,
yeah,
right? There's the make stuff up phase, and then there's the non-make stuff up phase.
yeah,
And so yeah, but that make stuff up phase is really important, right?
it
Uh,
is. No, it's crucial. But I will say though, I talk about the strong desire to go to Chicago, but I might get 3/4 away to Chicago and say, it's really not Chicago I need to go to. I really need to go to Madison, Wisconsin.
yeah.
And then I start, once I get to Madison, it's like, well, actually, really what I need to do is I need to go 15 miles to the west. There's a location there. So that's kind of how it works.
Yeah.
It's like there's a burning, like I can see it very clearly, though it may change, but even what the essence of it is still there.
So sometimes I find that I want to go to a certain place and work on something, but it's too important to work on. I can't work on it yet. And so I have to circumnavigate around it. I have to create ancillary things that help support the main thing. It's hard to describe. When I'm writing up things, like I'm working on an organizational series of chapters for Smoking Wyrm right now. So each issue is probably about 4 or 5 issues, maybe 10, I don't know. I'm going to have a different organization. And they're going to tie in and have mechanics and everything. There's a whole thing that I'm working on. But there's a couple organizations that I've had long term in my game that I want to write up. And this is part of the motivator to do this series was to get to do those.
Right.
And what I've discovered is sometimes I have to, I have to crawl before I can walk. And so I need to write up an organization that has nothing to do with the organization that I really want to work on in order to get my headspace around how I do that. And then I can focus on the organization that I actually care about. And so sometimes that's because it's emotionally loaded. This is something that I've had with me for a long time. It's been a part of my game world for a long time, and it's important to me. And I don't want to screw it up. So I'll go try something else first. Say, oh, I can do that. So now I can psych myself up to get to the thing I really want to work on. Or sometimes I'm just not sure how I want to build it yet. And so I'll go build something similar.
Well, and I think that's another thing too, because like for instance, there's nothing I've ever really written that's really been, that's not true, but I really don't write adventures.
Yeah, me either.
And I don't really write hex crawls.
Yeah.
But I need to, for a Goblins project, I need to do kind of a hex crawlish kind of thing. So, but then now it's like, okay, now what do I do? I can't just write one because I don't know. So then I got to start looking at different ways. Like even for adventures, what I started doing for one of the reasons I took through Old Tan's Door, I'm planning on running it on Foundry. So I've been copying and pasting and putting it into journal entries into there, but that's forcing me to kind of look at what he's doing. And so it's like there's ways that you can do something, another activity that can help train you to look at things a certain way, so that when you go to do a thing, then you're like, okay, now I get it.
Exactly. And that's why we have these big reference libraries, right? so that we can go to look at other people, how people have done things, and say, ooh, I like that, but I wouldn't do it this way. Or sometimes I find something, I'm like, you know what? This is exactly how I would do it. I don't need to write this. It's done.
Right.
And so then the question is, what else can I do? Maybe something adjacent to it.
Yeah, because there's really ultimately, even doing this, like I'll just let out the one of the things that's been driving me for a long time has been this concept of the Forbidden City. Or it's a massive land that's been sunken into the jungle, and there's these factions.
Right.
And it is, I think it's got gems in it. It's a wonderful, wonderful setting, except it just fails in many ways. I think because of, who knows, time, page count, whatever it may be. But, my idea is to take that, but put it into a dimensional space, and then having it kind of also have lots of these odds and ends and have factions. I just realized I can't do that right now because there's so much I don't know how to do.
Right. So you could do little chunks of similar things. You could write a couple factions.
So, or like the goblins, what I'm going to do, well, maybe what I learned from goblins, I can apply to that.
Yep, exactly.
And so it's like, okay, and so sometimes I think when we have these things, it's kind of nice to, you still have them, like they're going to happen. I'm just not ready. But look at things that you can do that are productive things, whether it's for your personal game or whether it's for another writing project, and just think of ways you can step towards where you're lacking in order to get that to be filled in.
Yes, I would agree with you. That's another way to motivate yourself or create a muse to get to your ultimate goal. And you've created a couple projects along the way that either help support that thematically or teach you the writing chops to get you there, right? Give you
and when I was writing the background for this, because I was just making stuff up, there's a big MSU going on. It informed the cosmology of the Fane of the Fly God.
Cool.
And so it's like, as I'm realizing as I'm doing this, even though I don't have a setting, I don't necessarily run, but like, okay, there's a cosmology that's going on here of law and chaos, in my version of thinking about law and chaos and what that means. And then they kind of start to inform each other.
Yeah. And so that's why I'm working on this aerial monster book, right? is I'm actually more interested in things like Spelljammer and Skycrawl and Crawljammer and these kind of sky floating ship things and
Yeah.
stuff. And I was working on these aerial monsters for myself because I want to explore that space. And I'm like, well, you got to have critters up there. And then that's where the biologist kicks in. And he's like, well, how do you get critters, right? How do I put goblins in the sky, right? And things. So I start looking at how that, who else has done this, right? Who else has done something similar to what I want to explore visually, narratively, and so on and so forth. And so, then I'm like, well, what is the sky made of? What's made of air? There are different layers in the sky, so there's different air densities there, but each of those have their own unique, things, their properties. And that becomes like, what's the difference between a tropical jungle and a temperate jungle, right? Or a temperate rainforest and a tropical rainforest. They're both rainforests, but they're very different. And so one of that, so you start moving down that rabbit hole of what does the sky look like? How does it interact? It's a place, but it's also multiple places.
But have you thought about taking that same level of, we'll call it complexity, but apply non-scientific ways of thinking about it?
So I do. I'm working in kind of a pseudo-scientific manner. It's very hard for me to pull back from the concept of ecology and create. I don't want to make monsters that are just, this is a monster. There you go.
No, but I mean, like for instance, like maybe there's a rainforest in this particular area because there is an ancient other being that inhabits this. It's one of the elder earth spirits, and this is where she resides and where she sleeps for 1,000 years and until
Absolutely.
she awakens.
So the fact that you have the rainforest, right, doesn't preclude how the rainforest got there for non-natural processes. But in general, when you've got you're going to have a lot of rainforests. Some of them are going to be natural,
right?
Okay? So it's nice to define the background and then say, now this is a special call out. And and to me, I have never seen a book that explores adventuring in skies, right, in air or in space, in a fantasy setting, that really distinguishes between layers of sky.
But maybe like the layers could be like those are the domains of a particular group, and that it was settled in a council back, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, but they also, there are things that just naturally can and can't exist biologically,
right?
Levels, or need adaptations. And that's what I'm kind of interested in, is what are those adaptations? How do you put a tree in the sky?
Did you ever read Larry Niven's The Integral Trees?
Oh my God. I have to tell you that The Integral Trees and the Smoke Ring are two of my favorite books. Bar none. I have at least 4 copies of each.
It's more interesting in what was going on with the world and how it worked than necessarily the storyline that was provided.
Yeah. So so Larry Niven, when he was when he was investigating the integral trees and in the idea of a smoke ring, right, and everything, the location was the main character. It wasn't the characters, right?
It's the tree.
It was the tree, right? and so I don't know when you read those. I first read those as a teenager.
Yeah, me too. I've only read it once back in high school.
Yeah, so I've read them about a dozen times, and I have the audiobooks. I've listened to them probably that many times too. And the plot's kind of thin. I don't have a problem with that. Larry Niven was writing for a different reason.
Right.
It's like H.P. Lovecraft didn't really like plot, right? He liked atmosphere. Larry Niven was writing for atmosphere in those books. And so that's exactly where I went. I started thinking, how do I put things in the sky? Who's done that? Larry Niven's done it, right? On a super hardcore science level, right? That just appeals to me because he was really talking about the physics and dynamics of torus clouds in space being torn apart by binary stars, and what impact that had on people and on other creatures. And so I'm like, oh, integral trees. Well, the integral trees only exist in a torus cloud state because they have things, stress is at both ends and everything. So if I don't have that situation, how else could I do it? And so I start looking at biology in general is always my default, you know, because it's the easiest thing to explain. And I'm like, oh, well, you know, I mean, there are leaves. Leaves are gas producers on trees and all plants. Chloroplasts and chlorophyll produces gas. It's a gas exchange mechanism. So what if those leaves were just modified to become gas bladders, right? Well, we have that. Kelp has that, right? Those are modified leaves that have gas bladders that create air bubbles inside the plant to help keep buoyancy so that the actual kelp can rise to the surface. Even though it's at a level, it's rooted at a level where it normally wouldn't get sunlight. So that's not that far of a stretch to say, well, we could have trees that have plants, or we can have trees that have leaves that produce gas that create gas bladders. And then what would things look like around that? And so, and the nice thing is once you've got a floating tree, you have a floating ecosystem, and you have things that can come to the tree and things that can leave the tree and things that can move between trees.
And you also have the interaction of the tree, like what happens when it rains.
Yeah. Well, so think then is, does it rain in the sky? Well, sometimes it does, obviously, because in the lower atmosphere, it falls from the sky where it condenses past condensation level, right? When relative humidity goes over 100%, rain falls from the sky. Because that water vapor condenses to the point where gravity pulls it down. So I have that situation in my game world, which, by the way, influenced by Larry Niven because it's a ring world. And so, you know, I've been long fascinated with his writing. And so then I'm like, okay, so if I've got floating trees, what do they look like? Well, they don't look like an integral tree, right? Which is two tufts at the end in opposing fashion. They don't look like an arboreal tree. They don't look like a tree like you and I would have. They look different. And so how do they look different? And so then you could create a couple trees. So I've got a monster that's a tree, and it has different ages, and things happen to it historically over time as it ages. And so it has different things that have impacted it that have never left, because it has buoyancy, that have, you know, one of the things I loved about Larry Niven's work were the parasites and what we call parasitoids that lived off the trees and lived amongst them, right? And so we have that in the real world. You have ants and things like this and stuff that and woodpeckers and, you know, squirrels and lots of animals that move up and down the tree and live in it. And so that allows you to have these types of things then, creatures that may be limited in terms of movement through the sky, but can in certain instances move. And so they're up in these trees. So I created parasitic infestation. You know, as a tree ages, it gets more and more parasites. This is a monster, right? And I'm like, suddenly this monster is an ecosystem, and it allows each one of those can be different. And so it's not just, oh yeah, you roll up to a tree, right, in your skyship. It's you roll up to a tree, and by the way, it has another skyship that's impacted in it. You don't know if that's a castaway where you have living people, or if they've all died and they've become undead or something, you know. So that creates a whole set of environments, and really, you know, influences my thinking on what monsters I put up in the sky, I guess, is the short.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think the thing is, you know, and I don't think everybody has to know it, but I think when it helps us to kind of make a world feel probably more reasonable, even if people aren't seeing all the gears and mechanisms, rather than just being there's a gelatinous cube.
And so that's the cool thing is, you know, what I spent the last 2 days writing was, how do those layers of sky interact? How do winds move, right? Well, they're generated along the ring because of the ring moves in a spinward direction, and that creates air movement. Actually, it's friction against the surface that kicks it up. And so you start thinking about these biomechanics of stellar objects, and everything, and how things move around. But that's really critically important. It's critically important for your creatures, so you can understand where you might encounter a creature in the sky traditionally. But it's also important for your airships, right? Because you need to know how they're going to move. And so just like there's a difference between a scree field and a trail on a mountain, and you're going to get a wagon up the trail, but you can't get it up the scree field. You know, those are important nuances.
Right.
And so I spent like, I don't know, I wrote 2,000 words on this is what the layers look like, and here's the definitions, and all that's really important for me. Will that show up in the final product? I don't know, but it's certainly,
But at least inform the final product.
yeah, it's absolutely going to inform the final product. And depending on, now that I'm playing with it as I'm writing it, which is always a nice combination, you know, you know, I'll know whether I think it's absolutely essential, right? Is this something that I can just move to an encyclopedia entry in my game world and then it gets buried and I know all about it, but nobody else does? Or is this something that I think is really worth sharing with people because they might be able to get some utility out of it?
Yeah, and there's
thinking about,
probably,
well,
it's hard to know the
cool.
market, but you can almost see if you get a good illustrator and to just go through this and treat it kind of like a serious, like, scientific book.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to do, right? So I've had a character, his name is Zolgi Harrison, since I was in high school, who, you know, was always like, it was
Yeah.
always Zolgi Harrison's Guide to the Swamp Monster, right?
Yeah.
And I would draw a picture and I would give it a title, and as a kid, and I was like, so this is Zolgi Harrison's journal, like Darwin's journal on the Beagle. This is Zolgi Harrison's journal from his, like, you know, decades long voyage into the sky, right? And so what does that look like? And there are little, and what's nice about that is you can put in cool anecdotes, right? And he can talk about things. This ties in with, in the Smoking Wyrm, I have a series of botanical articles that are all about different plants and their medicinal values and stuff. And they're written by another person. Her name is Wilhelmina Culpepper. Culpepper is a real guy from the 1600s, was one of them, is a very famous British almost doctor who rebelled against the medical system and put out this treatise on herbology, one of the first herbal books. And heresy made it public knowledge, right? And so doctors were really upset because he basically took all these things that they knew, put it down in writing, and then handed it to people. And villages would pool their resources to buy an herbal so that they could then go down the street and pick up all the common weeds that they were otherwise, you know, getting rid of, and use those to cure themselves. And so I took that concept and I've been doing it for DCC. Every issue of the Smoking Wyrm has 2 or 3 plants in it. And so I created this character, Wilhelmina Culpepper, and gave her a little bit of history and stuff. And she has little anecdotes in there. You know, she'll crawl across or come across a weird plant that maybe has some poisonous properties, and she'll be like, oh, and you know, you have to be really careful when you carry this because, as my retainer found out,
Yeah.
it can kill you.
My former retainer.
My former retainer. Poor John, he died. You know? And so you know, it gives. I think at least, I don't know if anybody else cares, but I think it gives a cool kind of sense of immediacy.
Yeah.
And a neat anecdote, you know, and it drills home that this can kill you if you don't do it right.
I have a friend, her dad was experimental. He liked to go out in the woods and, you know, get things and then take them home and eat them. So he would even take stuff that was toxic.
Yeah.
You could boil it, like the milkweed pods. Apparently, if you boil them, if you eat them, they're toxic. But if you boil them and pour out the water, they're edible. I guess. But the problem was he liked doing this with mushrooms, but he was colorblind. And apparently he made some mistakes, and she has memories of him running outside and making himself vomit because he assumed he just poisoned himself. It's like, what a character.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to wonder, how is it that we ever thought that we should eat this, right? Somebody had to be the first person that said, you know what, hold my beer, I'll eat it.
Well, or like, well, I'm vomiting, but what if we boil it and then pour it out? Okay.
Pour it out. And so that's one of the cool things that I like to do, is talk about the strange ways in which you turn this plant root into something usable. And it's like, you know, you have to, if you read the original herbal, it has these insane suggestions, right? You need to hide it inside your shoe for a week under a bed, and then you need to, you know, you boil it in vinegar, and then after you boil it in vinegar, you pickle it with some horse dung, and then you let that sit for a month, and then you can uncork it and you can pull your root out and grind it, and then, you know, you can do this with it. And so So one of the fun things that I do is I just make that stuff up, right? I'm like, oh yeah, I have about 30 herbology books, all
So that would
serious.
be funny for the characters. You know, get rid of the potions of healing or whatever, saying you just been poisoned by a manicore sting.
Yeah.
This is what you got to do.
Well, and so that's where it's really cool, because there are occult or fantastic elements to real herbs, right? So you get like wolfsbane. Well, wolfsbane is traditionally in fantasy something you can use to drive off werewolves. So when I wrote the wolfsbane entry, I was like, oh well, in DCC we have something called luck, and wolfsbane. If you happen to take the leaf of the wolfsbane, chew on it for a couple minutes, and then put it in your shoe, right, and walk around with it in your shoe, it creates a condition in which the wolf is repelled from you, and it will basically, if it was going to attack you, it'll attack the next nearest person.
Right. But you need to know about it ahead of time.
But you need to know about it ahead of time. You have to walk around with your wolfsbane, and if you don't, you're gonna get attacked.
Yeah, it's not a matter of like I have a ring I put on. It's like no, you got to chew it and you got to stick it on your shoe or in your shoe.
And so that the cool thing is well, what if everybody knows about that and the whole party has wolfsbane? I'm like, well, then it doesn't know who to attack, and it in confusion it flees, right? And so there's if you think about it, it's really like a twisted thing. I'm trying to get a party to all carry wolfsbane, chew it, and then put it underneath their shoes and walk around as a party with wolfsbane in their shoes to see if I want to see if a party ever does that. That would be so cool to find out that some adventuring group read that and was like, we got to do this.
Yeah.
Right.
But it attracts vampires, unfortunately.
But it attracts vampires. And so
they love the smell.
So that's the cool thing you can do with these things. I love taking these real world things and then saying, I'm in a fantasy atmosphere and giving it a twist, but still having most of it be true and factual and workable. If so yeah. So that's I've been applying what I've been doing with Culpeppers to this Zolgi Harrison's guide.
That sounds like fun. Well, I think there's a gal who did a herbology book, fantasy herbology book.
Yeah, Exalted Funeral.
I did not get it, but it looked beautiful.
$750,000 in Kickstarter.
So, your timing's off, Trevor.
My timing was off. Well, so hers is only got 100 herbs in it. When I'm done with Culpeppers, it'll probably have 400 to 500 herbs in it. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is, well, I can only get 2 or 3 of these per issue of Smoking Wyrm, and I only put Smoking Wyrm out 4 times a year at best. So I'm thinking about doing more of them. I'd like to kind of set my schedule up so I do kind of 1 a week, maybe 2 a week, and then put out a book, right?
Yeah.
And so move around in the Smoking Wyrm so that I get a little bit of A and a little bit of B herbs and C herbs and everything. They get a dappling of them, but if you want 50 herbs in the A section, you're going to go buy the guide.
Well, and I think even you don't that you're reprinting material kind of can seem kind of weird, but the other thing is like there's going to be people that say I just want a book of herbs, even if I've already got them in my DCC. I just want them all collected. So you're really not
right. So I don't generally like recollections, but I like them if they have added value, and if they have a lot of added value, that's a great idea.
So what I'm planning on doing is I'm planning on taking the bestiary from Journey in the Madlands and actually just redoing the whole thing with OSE, and then utilizing those and plus some others, and just doing a bestiary for post-apocalyptic, because I guess OSE is going to be coming out, Necrotic Gnomes and coming out with a post-apocalyptic version of their game.
That's awesome.
But I was just like, well, but at least it's all collected, and even if I do put it into Journey of the Madlands, people may or may not want to do that, but at least it's all collected as a bestiary.
Yeah,
and I think there's gonna be a lot of people who just want a bestiary.
And the other thing is, you've mentioned a couple times you might want to think about Dungeon Crawl Classics. They're coming out with Radiation Crawl Classics in the next year or 2.
Well, the thing is,
post-apocalypse.
That's the thing I'm going to talk to you about, because I don't have. I do know you mentioned that they're good a lot of times if it's approved of buying X amount of copies.
Yeah, so it's in the licensing agreement.
So the thing is, and that may be something I'd be willing to take some of my stuff to convert over, but I need somebody like yourself to actually do the document. I need to make it worthwhile. I don't necessarily make any money, but I don't want to lose money either. So that's something when I look at like the spells for Fane of the Fly God, all I did is just reskin D&D style spells and just
Right.
made them weird and gross. But if you're going to do a spell in Dungeon Crawl Classics, it's got to be beyond that because you got to have that table to roll on.
Yeah, and the other thing is it depends on if you're doing one super concentrated spell, or some of the spells take 4 or 5 adjacent concepts and spell concepts and roll them in together. And so there's a couple different ways to build those spells, and they can be complicated. But it's the payoff is really good usually. And so
Yeah, and I
like
just know that it's not something like with OSE. Yeah, I can just go in and you know
yeah.
pull up an ogre, and then make some adjustments to the ogre and say, okay, we're good here. What really matters is the text and the narration for my best area. It's not the mechanics. The mechanics are pretty easy to do. It's just the other stuff. So, but anyway, Dungeon
Yeah,
Crawl Classics, I realized I don't have the chops, nor the desire, nor the time to be able to get into that particular space.
sure. Yeah, because it is it is a little more esoteric. I mean, you
Oh
definitely
yeah.
when you look at it, and I think it has real world utilitarian payoff, for players.
Oh no, it does. I mean, the reason you a person, you know, to cast a spell, there's a reason why they set up the way they do, and there's a reason why people love the spell casting. Either the mage will be doing it all the time, or they just say, no, you don't do it until it's time.
Yeah,
And then we all get way back.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
it is a completely, so the idea is, for those who don't know, like with Dungeon Crawl Classics, you know the spell you're casting, but you're really rolling to seeing what happens, and it may go in a way you don't really intend or want. That fireball could be smaller or much bigger than you intend.
Right. And I've seen I've seen, like, think of magic missile, which is one little d4,
Yeah.
one little d4, one little d4. And I've seen in DCC you can have that one little d4 on a very minimal success, but I've seen people cast magic missile and get 12 missiles that all do d12 plus caster level each,
Yeah.
and that can get up to 100 200 hit points of damage. um we were playing Steading of the Hill Giant, G1, and I had a party we were playing DCC second, third level, and the party had crawled up into the steading, and there's an airspace. I don't know if most people realize this. There's an airspace at the edge of the steading from the wall to the ceiling. There's a space there, and it's giant sized. It's small for giants, but it's man sized
Yeah.
for people. You can crawl up there, and then you crawl up into the attic space, essentially, right up into the timbers. And so I had a party that was up in the timbers in the roof, watching the giant hall, and all the giants are arrayed down there. And someone's just like, "Oh, I'm going to cast Choking Cloud." I'm like, "Okay," and they're like, "And I'm going to burn 20 spell points. I'm going to really burn down my physical stats." So you're sacrificing physical stats for a bonus, and they killed 80% of the giants in a single spell. Right?
He looks at
Like,
everybody else and like, what are you doing for this party? I'm
which,
doing all the work.
yeah, I think I deserve 80% of the treasure here, right? I mean, but it's amazing. Now that person is got weeks and weeks of physical recovery, because burning ability attributes is
Right.
a simple thing, but the payoff is huge, right? And so that's the cool thing about DCC, is it's really swingy narratively. Players can take it and really change it.
Yeah.
And different groups have different levels of acceptance of that. Some groups are really cautious. Some groups are just balls to the walls. Let's do this. And it's always cool to see the differences between groups. So,
Well, I think we're hitting the time space continuum. I think I got a dog that's she's ready to be released from her kennel.
all right. Well, it's always good to talk to you, Jeff.
Yeah, likewise, Trevor. I'll have to have you soon. We need to talk about flies.
We got to talk about flies. I got to tell you, yeah, we can
Well,
we can go down a rabbit hole with flies.
we go. I don't know if that's mixing metaphors or not, but yes.
Well, there are flies that go down rabbit holes.
Yeah, I believe it. I believe you.
So,
We can talk about those too.
okay,
So thanks again, Trevor. I appreciate
not a
it.
problem. Have a great day.